Admissions to mental health treatment centers in South Florida are spiking after the Valentine's Day massacre at Stoneman Douglas High School. But it's not just teenagers who have suffered trauma that should be getting mental health care. It's estimated that 2/3 of teens don't receive mental health care treatment that they need. The American Academy of Pediatrics recently issued guidelines calling for universal depression screenings for young people. But for the African American community, addressing mental health care is still stigmatized and often underfunded. Dr. Michael Lindsey is the director of the McSilver Institute for Poverty Policy and Research at New York University. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
There was a statistic about child suicide that was absolutely staggering. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so a recent study found that in the last 20 years there's been a spike in suicide, particularly among African American boys between the ages of 5 and 11. And in fact, what it suggests is that the rates of suicide for that group are highest and higher than any other group among that age category.
Age 5 to 11.
Age 5 to 11.
Why is it that these kids aren't getting the diagnosis that they need and the treatment that they need?
Well, there's a lot of stigma related to mental health treatment, as you mentioned in your opening. I think that there's a lot of sort of thoughts about you're crazy, you don't air your dirty laundry in public, in terms of how families socialize their children around the experience of mental illness. And certainly for boys, we've actually socialized boys to not cry, to man up, to essentially blunt their emotional expression.
To internalize everything.
To internalize everything. And I think related to that, you have, these boys have no place to articulate their pain and the struggles that they have with relationships or other kinds of things. And so it relates to the spike in what we see around suicide.
So even if a family recognizes that there is a child in the house that needs help and needs some treatment, what are the difficulties, what are the obstacles to finding that treatment?
Well, sometimes it's exactly that point. Where are treatments available? Certainly we know that when schools are providing services to kids, it's a place to, for them to have greater access to care. I mean, I think that's a huge issue. Sometimes it's the fact that parents really don't understand what the signs and symptoms of a mental illness look like. So oftentimes, if kids are not willing to or interested in doing chores, they're described as being lazy. And so sometimes, we have to educate the parents that we work with to understand that it may be symptomatic of depression. And so, that kid may not be lazy, but experiencing depression symptoms.
The American Academy of Pediatrics suggestion for universal depression screenings, would that help?
It will definitely help, because what we know is that depression is a precursor to suicide, right? So untreated depression leads to higher suicide rates. And I think the extent to which we can identify kids earlier in their experiences of depression symptoms, it could lead to better treatment, better recognition. And so that's why I believe, that the screenings are incredibly important.
We've seen over the course of the last number of years, every year it seems that there is a year-on decline in funding available for mental health, either facilities or programs. Is there any suggestion that you think that there is a greater awareness that these programs can be more helpful and that there should be more funding for these programs?
There absolutely should be more funding. I know there's been some efforts in the Congress, in the House and the Senate, to fund school-based mental health providers to be in schools. Every school should have a provider in that school. And I think the other thing that I want to mention too is that oftentimes funding for mental health services actually is related to having a diagnosis. And so if we can think about ways to creatively support prevention services, we can actually mitigate the extent to which kids are experiencing symptoms that lead to a disorder. So I think, even prevention and the way that we conceptualize the support of mental health treatment is really, really critical.
Jay-Z recently shared his own journey with the New York Times on the importance of therapy and how it had helped him, in his life. Do you think stories like those help to move the needle in terms of acceptance?
Absolutely, because what it does is it normalizes the experience.
Right.
So often people are reticent to be involved in treatment because of the image that they think it will portray, that they're crazy, something is wrong with them. And I think when you have powerful individuals like Jay-Z who acknowledge that they are actually struggling with a mental illness and that they sought help, it really helps to normalize the experience.
When we were talking about stigma, one part of the stigma piece is also cultural differences and in recognizing what is normal and acceptable within one culture and what is different in another culture. Is part of the piece here that there are not enough African American practitioners, not enough clinics in those communities that understand those communities, understand their population, and can work with those families?
Yeah, I think all the things you just named are really critical. We need more services in communities. You know, poverty-impacted communities are so underserved and so under-resourced, and so connections to community-based treatments that are available to them is really, really critical. You know, I also think that you know, we've got to figure out a way to make, you know, services accessible, and we need more providers of color to, you know, be able to, you know, deliver those services to kids and families. Certainly some of the things I think are important for providers who are cross-cultural, like, for example, white clinicians who are working with African-American clinicians, is to help kids and their families understand what is going to happen during the treatment experience and giving them a sense of what to expect.
What the destination is, what the road is.
Exactly, because this is the first time for many folks they'll have access to treatment. But there are other times when we have families who have had histories of involvement in treatment, and that treatment didn't go so well. And so we actually encourage clinicians to explore treatment histories and to sort of figure out what went right and what went wrong to really help families to address sort of those barriers and stigmas related to the experience of being involved in treatment.
When you're treating a young person who has depression, who has been diagnosed with depression, is the path the same if that child is African American or if that child is Hispanic or that child is white?
Well, what the research suggests is that relative to white youth, African American and Latino youth underutilized mental health treatment for depression. So I think there is an issue with respect to ethnic minority youth, particularly Latino and African Americans, around their mental health treatment. So the path is going to be different. It's likely going to reflect stigma. It's likely going to reflect a sort of family experience whereby there's a lot of resistance and perhaps even shame in terms of being involved in treatment. And so I think providers who work with Latino and African American youth in particular have to understand that experience and what those families and children might bring to the treatment encounter.
Thanks so much, Michael Lindsey. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.